Hi everyone, it's Lisa Cassidy here, fantasy author. This is a new project I'm starting where I'm going to do a read along, starting with my A Tale of Stars and Shadow series. Whenever I get the time, I'm going to narrate a chapter of the book through to the end, and then I'll keep going with the series as well. And then at the end, I'm going to add some author commentary. So my thoughts kind of as I was writing that chapter that I've just read out, and kind of any comments that I want to make or interesting things that was kind of floating around in my head while I was writing it. So each video will be one chapter of me reading the book, with a little gap in the middle for those who may not have read it, who don't want the spoilers of my author commentary, and then I'll do some comments at the end. Please leave any comments or questions at the bottom. I'm more than happy to answer them. I really hope you enjoy these, and I'm interested to see how I go kind of reading the book out loud for the first time. All right, enjoy. Hi everyone. Welcome to chapter 1 of A Tale of Stars and Shadow. Let's see how we go with me reading this aloud to you. Hope you enjoy it. Okay, let's go. It was the deepest hour of the night. Rain and wind lashed at Feather Bay, turning its usually tranquil surface into a turmoil of white-capped waves. Merchant ships anchored in the seething waters listed heavily, pulling up hard against their anchors, spray soaking their open decks. The Shadowhawk stood still, hands folded loosely before him, voluminous cloak hiding his form. His attention focused on one ship amongst the many. Having arrived earlier in the afternoon with barely enough time to anchor before the storm hit, it had yet to unload. Anticipation kindled in his stomach with a slow burn that he savoured like a fine wine. As the sensation unfurled and spread through his body, he remained outwardly still, ignoring the rain driving into his masked and hooded face and the wind tearing and clawing at his cloak. His gaze narrowed, tracking a moving pinprick of light on the deck, likely the handheld lantern of a crew member with the unenviable duty of checking that everything remained locked down in the storm. Abruptly, the Shadowhawk shifted attention, warned by a flickering in the shadows of the narrow alley to his left. His hand slid to the narrow blade he wore tucked into the small of his back. A man emerged, familiar, offering a slight nod as he came to stand at the Shadowhawk's side. The Shadowhawk moved his hand away from the blade and slid his gaze back to the ship. We've been watching the docks since the Merry Raven berthed. 2 Falcons on board, with a shift change every 4 hours. Next shift should be changed before the dawn. The man's voice was pitched above the sound of the wind and held no trace of nervousness or uncertainty. The Shadowhawk's lip curled. Only 2 Falcons. And your group is in position? It was always a different group, each led by a different man or woman who knew nothing about the other groups. Each had a different way of communicating with him, and none of them knew the Shadowhawk's face. Awaiting your word. The Shadowhawk nodded. Wait a half turn, then follow me out. Make for the cargo hatch at the stern. It was too dark, the weather too wild for anyone to notice the shadow slipping over the starboard railing of the Merry Raven and making straight for the main hatch leading inside. It lifted easily, a faint light glimmering from below, but nobody shouted or called the alarm. The Shadowhawk dropped inside, crouching on the top step and securing the hatch behind him. Immediately the driving rain was cut off, and he was left with only the roar of the wind and waves hurling themselves at the ship. At the bottom of the ladder, 2 narrow passageways led in different directions. The light was coming from under the door of a cabin at the end of the passageway leading straight ahead, probably the captain's room. The Shadowhawk turned left. Darkness was his friend, and as he moved, he gathered the shadows around him, allowing them to shroud his cloaked form. He padded quickly through the ship, moving with the lurching of the floor under his feet. One lit cabin at deck level held a handful of soldiers playing cards, presumably those on watch, but the rest of the crew should be below trying to sleep through the storm. He turned away. He needed to find the sleeping crew. They would likely be positioned close to the cargo hold, and despite the sound the storm was making, he couldn't take the risk that they might hear him. He'd done this many times before, and it didn't take him long to make his way down to the bows of the ship and find the sleeping berth. Keeping the shadows close, anyone watching would see only moving darkness. He pulled the door closed and latched it. At the quiet snick of the latch falling into place, he waited, breathing to stay calm, but nobody inside roused. He thought about going back up, locking in the captain and the sailors playing cards, but they were awake. If one of them heard him doing it or tried to leave, but the storm was loud. It was unlikely they'd hear anything happening down in the cargo hold. And if they did, well, merchant sailors weren't soldiers. Decision made, he moved down the narrow passageway leading to the cargo hold. It was there he found his first obstacle, 2 armed falcons standing guard on either side of the hatch. Not that either of them would strike fear into anyone trying to get in. The Shadowhawk couldn't help the sharp smile of amusement that spread over his face at the sight. One was half leaning against the wall, his skin a green hue almost matching the colour of his wings, his left hand clutching his stomach. The other just looked bored. Their immaculate teal uniforms and silken wings contrasted sharply with the rough wood of the ship's interior and the dim light from 2 flickering torches further down the passageway, making them seem horribly out of place. Briefly, he considered sneaking past them in the shadows. He discarded the idea the moment he thought it. The seasick one was practically standing on the hatch, and the lamplight was strong enough to make the shadows surrounding him look unnatural if he stepped into it. A single steadying breath, and he summoned the deep, husky voice of the Shadowhawk. I've got an arrow drawn and pointed at your heart. One move, and I let loose. He was unarmed apart from the knife at his back, the knife he never used, but they didn't know that. He was utterly hidden by the darkness beyond the pool of lamplight. The 2 shadows jumped, the seasick one adding a shade of yellow to the green tinge of his skin. The other one's hands dropped to the hilt of his sword, but the Shadowhawk barked, Don't! There's no need for either of you to die tonight. You know who I am. Do as I say and you live. Start walking backwards, slowly, arms up. They shared a glance, neither willing to attack with the threat of an arrow coming out of the darkness at them, but still reluctant to leave their post. My patience is running out. His voice turned edgy, dark. Start walking, or I loose this arrow. The second will follow before the remaining one of you can get anywhere near me. His glance fell on the face of the seasick falcon, a young man surely no older than 20, and for a moment guilt tried to flicker. He squashed it ruthlessly. After sharing another glance, the 2 falcons began inching backwards up the passageway, hands in the air, their wings making their usually graceful movements awkward and clumsy in the confined space. He moved them back until they reached a hold he'd spotted earlier, on his way from the sleeping berth. Inside, not a sound. Shut the door behind you. Go. They hesitated only a moment longer, the seasick one swaying, clutching his stomach harder. The second one opened the door and shoved his comrade in before following suit. Once the door swung shut, the Shadowhawk moved quickly, dropping the bar over the doorway. The sharp scent of penned sheep had hit him earlier as he passed the doorway. The hold where livestock were kept would be one that could be barred from the outside, holding back any panicked animal herd trying to flee. A perfect place to trap someone. Besides, there was no small satisfaction in sticking the pretty winged falcons in with the stinking sheep. Mouth curling in contempt at their uselessness, the Shadowhawk returned to the hatch leading to the cargo hold, listening hard through the rain drumming on the deck below. Nothing else loomed out of the darkness, so he opened the hatch and dropped through before pulling it closed and securing it from the inside. It should prove a good enough obstacle if the crew on watch worked out what was happening. The 2 falcons wouldn't be missed until shift change at dawn, still at least 2 full turns away. Once that happened, he wouldn't have long before many more falcons descended on the Merry Raven. The sheer number of crates stacked in the hold gave him pause, but his informants on the docks had told him they were all full of supplies of wheat from Montan. His eyes tracked the dim interior of the hold until landing on the unloading door at the stern. He winched it open, ignoring its loud screech and the icy wind rushing in as the door splashed down into roiling ocean. Several 2-man rowboats were waiting, rocking wildly on the storm-tossed waves. At the sight of the opening door, one of the boats came in closer. It unloaded 4 men into the hold. Seasoned sailors, all of them, with the way they easily jumped the gap from boat to hold, not even a glance at the raging ocean below their feet. At a nod from the Shadowhawk, they began working, dragging crates over to be loaded onto the waiting boats. By the time the 3rd boat was full, shoulders and arms ached, but he gritted his teeth and increased his pace, forcing the pain to the back of his mind. When all the boats were filled with crates, he looked up at the sky. The rain and low cloud made it difficult to tell the time, but they couldn't have longer than a half turn before dawn. The first 3 boats were already almost back to shore as the 4th one turned and began following. The Shadowhawk straightened his aching back and looked up towards the citadel. It was time to go. Any longer and he'd risk getting caught, and he was too smart for that. Casting a regretful look at the remaining crates, he reached inside his cloak and drew out a carved wooden arrow fletched in black. After carefully placing it on the floor by the hatch entry, he headed over to the cargo door and leaped across into the final boat. Go, get out of here, he barked at the rowers. We need to make it to shore before Light or the Falcons coming for shift change spot us. The wind was bitingly cold and the water had it calmed. The two men at the oars struggled for what felt like ages against the strong current, the work made harder by how heavily laden they were. An edge of anxiety tugged incessantly at him despite his physical weariness. Falcons would be searching the water and shoreline relentlessly once they reached the Merry Raven at dawn and saw what had been stolen. And though he'd done this many times before, he never took for granted that one day he might be caught. Dawn was a faint pink glow on the horizon when they finally dragged the boat up onto the sand of a beach on the western headland of Feather Bay. Panting, aching, and stiff with cold, they all clambered out and joined the hive of activity around the other boats already ashore. They'd been pulled up high onto the sand, and more helpers were there to unload them and carry crates away. He recognised one of the rowers, a carvy brewer in another life, and a handful of the others helping to unload crates. It had been a while since he'd worked with this group, but they were well practiced and efficient. Apart from leaders of each group, he didn't even know their names, and they had no more idea who he was than any other man, woman, or child on the streets of Dock City. It was safer for all of them that way. As each boat was unloaded, its crew pushed them back out into the water and rowed south. Once the sun rose, there'd be nothing more than one of the myriad fishing vessels out to get the morning's catch. None spoke to the Shadowhawk as he began helping to move the crates from the fourth boat into the backs of two large wagons. Dawn began inching across the sky, and the wind lost some of its strength, the pounding rain dropping to a light drizzle. They were tying down the load on the second wagon when a familiar figure appeared, stalking towards him with her customary confident gait. You got my message. He stepped away from the wagon to speak with her, not wanting any of the workers to overhear. You would have been shit out of luck if I hadn't, she observed. True, but letting her know too long in advance, that was risky. He shrugged. You know why I don't give you any notice. Yeah. She lifted her hand from where it rested on the hilt of the dagger she always wore on her belt, dark skin blending with the dim light as she dismissed his words with a sharp gesture. Even soaking wet from the rain, she was calm and collected. The first wagon is already sorted and we'll have the rest away by midday. After I've taken the cut for my people, we'll get the rest up north to Mareland for you. That was the usual arrangement. He used his people to identify the ships to hit and steal the supplies from. Saneer's network hid and distributed the goods to those who needed it. You never have told me how your people are different to the rest of Dock City or Mareland, he said casually, and I never will. He barked a laugh. Fair enough. And that's why I'll never give you advance notice. I don't trust you. It was her turn to laugh. I don't give a flying flea shit about your trust, Shadowhawk. It's enough to know that neither of us could operate without the other. Shadowhawk! He turned. The carvy brewer was pointing southeast, where two winged figures were outlined against the ever-lightening sky, making directly for the Merry Raven. Scorn simmered in his gut. They'd clearly waited for the storm to calm before risking flight and completing their shift change. Didn't want to sprain a wing, I suppose. Saneer's voice mirrored his contempt. He turned away, gaze following one of the wagons as it trundled away. Satisfaction displaced the scorn and the lingering cold and exhaustion he felt. There had been enough wheat in those crates to replace the yield destroyed in a recent avalanche that had badly affected several villages who relied heavily on farming for survival. But quick on the heels of his satisfaction came a burning shame. It wasn't enough. He should be able to do more, and hated that he didn't have the courage for it. Sighing, he rubbed at the beginnings of a headache throbbing at his temples. Always the same argument with himself. It got old and tiring. Go, get out of here. Saneer's sharp voice dragged him from his thoughts. I'll make sure the last wagon is sorted before the Falcons start searching the beaches. He nodded, taking a final glance at the remaining wagon before setting off with quick strides along the beach. Once out of sight of Saneer and the wagons, he tugged off his mask, shoving it deep inside his tunic, then shrugged out of the cloak and balled it up, tucking it under his arm. By the time he reached the waking streets of Dock City, he was just one of the crowd, an average, unremarkable human. All right, that's the end of chapter 1. again. So this is the spoilery part of this video. If you haven't read A Tale of Stars and Shadow through to the end, and you don't want spoilers, then I recommend stopping the video at this point and going on to chapter 2 when that comes out, if it's not out already when you're watching this. So I'm just giving it a few more seconds to give you time to kind of tune out, and then I'll start chatting. So in terms of just some author comments on chapter 1 of this book, obviously we're opening up with the Shadowhawk, and even though Talon is kind of the character that takes most of the screen time in the book, the Shadowhawk I kind of wanted throughout the pages, even though he only kind of comes in small moments, to really kind of infuse the book with that sense of the Robin Hood persona, this very mysterious figure who's clearly quite passionate about what he's doing and cares a lot, but we don't have a lot of context about why that is, or why really he's doing what he's doing, or how that came about. And I wanted to kind of bring that kind of very mysterious, secretive, what's going on here element to the book. And that's why I opened with this scene with the Shadowhawk kind of scouting out his latest score, and then carrying out the thievery, and also introducing the character of Sania, who, for those who read the series know, becomes quite an important character. From writing it, it's always difficult writing Shadowhawk scenes. Well, not difficult, but need to think a little bit more when I was writing the Shadowhawk scenes throughout the book, because of course it's Kewin who has a massive pair of wings, and the Shadowhawk presents as a human. And for the reader who doesn't know that the Shadowhawk is Kewin or anyone else of the characters in the book, I had to make sure with every scene that I'm writing with the Shadowhawk that if you do go back and read that knowing that he has wings, that's kind of explained in terms of the heavy cloak and the fact that he's maneuvering carefully in closed spaces. And that's something that starts off in this first chapter, but I had to be very careful of throughout the book, and then it kind of becomes much easier once he's revealed to the readers, and then later on, obviously, to the characters. But yeah, I think this was a really fun scene to open with. I really like the dark and stormy night vibe, and being able to kind of open the book that way was a lot of fun. If you have any more questions about this scene or what I was thinking as I was writing it, please drop your questions in the comment below. I'm very happy to answer down there, or if there's a lot of questions, potentially make another video to answer them for everyone. All right, well, thanks everyone for tuning in. Have a great day.